the outset, I thank organizers for inviting me here to speak. And I must confess that I'm coming for the first time in a big international conference like this, and so feel very overwhelmed by the task that is there. I think the first time and the speaking in the plenary is a pretty difficult task. Before I go into what I want to say, I think what Professor Jonathan Moreno said just now reminded me of a decade of struggle in India, where the techniques like narcoanalysis and brain mapping were used in a very frequent manner on thousands of detainees in order to interrogate them. And the struggle of participation of doctors in this kind of testing of or interrogation of detainees took us for a whole decade, fighting with the Human Rights Commission as well as filing cases in the Supreme Court in order to reverse the entire stuff. And today, fortunately, the practices have stopped. Or some people say that they have gone underground rather than really stopped. But to speak on these issues in a country like ours, despite being democracy, is extremely difficult because you get branded as anti-national in no time. Anyway, coming to the issue of clinical trials, and what I'm going to speak here is something that is based on my experiences. I'm not a bioethicist by training. I come from the human rights movement to the bioethics. I work more on the right to health issues. And I believe that bioethics in the developing country cannot remain separate from the activism. I also believe that it has to become the advocate of the patients and the research participants. I am in a way biased because I have taken public position on all these subjects, and what I'm going to talk here is not any great theory, but my experiences of my work. What I'm going to do is to tell you something about clinical trial industry in India and the legal and regulatory framework. And along with that, give you my own, framework of presentation where I believe that unless there is a pressure from below, the systems in the developing countries are very, very difficult to change. So bioethics, which is sitting in the academic and doing research, is sometimes not adequate to really make changes in the situation. As you know, that India is going through very high economic growth. There is a massive expansion of the private commercial sector, particularly pharmaceutical, hospitals, and diagnostic industries. India is a big supplier of generic drugs in the world. Almost 40% of the pharmaceutical production is exported. But at the same time, the access to healthcare, including the pharmaceuticals within the country, is very, very poor. There is increased inequalities. There is a huge poverty, as well as a large number of illiterate and semi-literate people. And there is no universal access to healthcare services, and that raises a lot of questions about India being a net exporter of drugs, while the people in India themselves remain, without the access. At the same time, I must add that within the health sector, it is the domination of the private industry, and there is a very little regulations over them. The legal and regulatory framework in India on the clinical trial till 2005 was much better. The Indian generic drug industry developed simply because of the kind of patent law they had. They did not provide patent for the product, but provided patent for the processes. And as a consequence, Indian industry was able to expand and come out with more generic products. That thing changed in 2003 when the product patents were accepted and the patents were provided for 20 years. Drugs and devices research is regulated as a part of a law. Till 2005, India did not allow the international clinical trial to take place unless they were already done in the same phase in the country of the origin. So there was a phase lag for doing the clinical trial in India till 2005. But in the amendments which were carried out in 2005, India decided that there should be more expansion of the clinical trial industry. And so in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, they started allowing the international simultaneous clinical trials in India. 2005 amendments also made mandatory the compliance with the Indian GCP, the online registration of the clinical trials, and the ethical review of the protocols. In a way, the whole system of the ethical review was grafted on a system which did not have any regulations. Like say our hospitals in India does not have to comply to any kind of standard quality regulations in order to get registration. Most of the hospitals in India are not still registered. A new law that is passed for the clinical trial establishment registration is still in the making. So suddenly you get research coming up in settings where the medical practice is completely deregulated. The ethics guidelines were also developed in 1980 by the Indian Council of Medical Research and updated in 2000 and 2006. And they are having the same standard, or perhaps in certain extent even better than the Helsinki Declaration, but they have no legal teeth. With the weak system and the kind of developments that took place, there were the consequences. The number of clinical trials increased. That means the business really went up, and they were being carried out in over 4,000 institutions all over the country. The phenomenal increase in the number of institutional and commercial ethics committees took place, over 500 in 2011. Reports of lack of training of members, lack of independent and good functioning of the ethics committee, and reports of the conflict of interest within the ethics committee started coming out regularly. In May 2012, the 59th Parliamentary Committee report documented irregularities in the drug regulators and the clinical trials. The approval of the new drugs and the exposed the nexus between the companies and the doctors. What was very shocking to us was the way the marketing for the clinical trial were done by the contract research organizations in order to get contracts from the overseas. There were three major, marketing devices that were used. The trials will be quick, they'll be cheap, and they'll be easy. Because of the large population and a lot of vulnerable people who are deprived of the health care, they said that it will be very easy to recruit them in the clinical trial because you will be providing care free of charge. At the same time, the low educations and the resources that people had made it also easy. And if people are not at all being treated, what they said that what you get are naive patients, treatment naive patients for whom you don't have to have any washout period. Cheap trials, of course, it is easier to do it in India because the prices are low, and the collaborators like doctors and the hospitals who are very used to the business model were easily available. Soon after, the controversy started coming up. The major thing that started getting reported and that came out were injuries and death in the international clinical trial. It was found that between 2005 and 2012, in 475 clinical trials of new chemical entities, there were something like 11,917 non-fatal serious adverse events and 2,645 deaths. Of them, only 89 were declared as causally related to the clinical trials and so eligible for the compensation. They were provided very pittance in the compensation, but there was no compensation for the injuries in the clinical trials. At the same time, several other controversies started hitting the headlines. The clinical trials on the psychiatric patients, on survivals of the 1984 Bhopal gas disasters, on the children in juvenile homes. There were several controversies related to the testing for the carcinoma cervix as well as for the prevention of that. One of the major was the HPV vaccine demonstration project, where in a phase 4 clinical trial, there were no good system created in order to follow up the girls who were given the HPV vaccine. Some 6-7 deaths took place, and there were no documentation to find out whether those deaths were related to the clinical trial or not. And the latest one that has come out is the visual inspection of cervix with the acetic acid, where 180,000 women were not tested because they were in the placebo control arm. And it is reported that some 254 women developed carcinoma of cervix and died in that. So these controversies really shook up the bioethics world. This is my major point here, that we people in the bioethics in India for the last 1 decade concentrated too much in the collaboration with the industry as well as in the researchers. Much of the efforts were made by the bioethics trained people in India, including myself. I am not trained, but at the same time, because of my own experience, I have been doing a lot of training in the bioethics. So bioethics training of the researchers and ethics committee members has been the major campaign. Being a part of ethics committee and contribute in the ethics review has been one of the major work that we have been carrying out. The bioethics people have been involved in formulation of new guidelines. There are also added efforts in some of the exposition that took place. I have also worked in several ethics committees, and I found that the whole structure is extremely difficult to make any impact. The institution doesn't provide really good autonomy to the ethics committee to function. Issues are not as much focused on the patients, but they are more focused on defending the institution. And the system does not prohibit the ethics committee shopping by the pharmaceutical companies and so on. On the other hand, I found that the activists from the human rights organizations and NGO took up the issue of injuries and the deaths in a very big way. Indian bioethics meetings lamented on the problems in the system but could not shake it. The NGOs and human rights activists seized the issues of death and injuries in clinical trial as a top concern. They opened the system up by meeting aggrieved participants and by bringing media spotlight on the problem. They systematically documented the cases. They used right to information law to force regulators and ministry to part with the information. They filed petitions in the Supreme Court for justice and also approached the National Human Rights Commission. It was not the bioethics academic, but they were the human rights activists who forced the government to come out with new regulations. There were major 5 components of the new regulations that are there. I'm not going to go into all of them. The first is treatment for the serious adverse events, independent assessment of the serious adverse events, the compensation for injuries and deaths, the registration of the ECs, which were not there earlier, is now being done, but they are tasked with the monitoring of these clinical trials and also given role in the assessment of the injuries and death. This is being given to those committees which are not functioning in any case. Mandatory audio-visual recording of the informed consent process has been brought in. Though these things are enacted, they are still being reviewed, and with a new government in power, we still don't know how it will go. What is very important is that the human rights activists were able to make a point that comprehensive and free medical management and treatment of all adverse events in clinical trials, irrespective of their relatedness to the experimental drug or the intervention made for the CTs. This is the right of the patients if they are on the clinical trial. The independent assessment of the fatal assays and for the relatedness to CTs by the expert appointed by the drug regulator. This is another, I think, innovation that the human rights activists pushed through in India. Most of the time it is the data safety monitoring boards appointed by the pharmaceutical company which take decision whether a causality relationship of SAE is with the clinical trial or not. The relatedness of the SAE is not merely with the adverse events of the experimental drug, but with the whole of the clinical trial. The injuries and deaths related to the ECT eligible for the monetary compensation, that is in addition to the treatment, and the formula for the monetary compensations are being debated at the moment. There were 7 criteria that came out with the relatedness, which have become very, very controversial, particularly the criteria C and D, which says that the failure of the investigational product to provide intended therapeutic effect. And the D is the use of placebo in the placebo-controlled trial. That means that any serious adverse event coming up because of the failure of the investigational product, or if placebo control is used, then all adverse events must be compensated monetarily in addition to providing care. Let me go into the final learnings. What I learned is that the bioethics training and research have long-term importance, and they are hence really essential. But problems are here and now. We take long time to create a new bioethics community and the regulatory system, but at the same time, the business really expands in a big way. So training on its own is unable to make system change. We also find that in developing countries, it is very difficult to change the system from within, unless there is a strong political pressure from the mass movement. It is not possible to really transform it. People in bioethics need to build alliances with the civil society and human rights activism to achieve their goal of making research ethical. Within them, I don't think the ethics committee is a forum where it could be done. Patients, participants' experience need to be documented, and they must form the foundation of research ethics. I think that is something that is missing, and we must give more attention to that. We need to reflect on the issue of vulnerability of participants in the developing countries from 2 additional perspectives. One is that if vulnerability demands additional protections and investment to improve the context that could prevent exploitation, then how could the research in developing countries be so cheap and quick? Even if it is cheap, it can't be quick. It should take longer time, simply because you have to create something more. If you want to really have a genuine informed consent process or respect to autonomy, you require more time in order to make people understand rather than having less time. In the entire process, there is no agency provided to the participants, patients and the participants. The storm gets only when there are scandals reported. They have no representation in the assessment of the injuries and the deaths, and there is no representation in the compensation process. It is all done by the experts. They may be bioethics experts or the medical experts. The causality relatedness of the injuries, as this process brought out, it really opened the Pandora's box. And suddenly we learned that there is no really definite science, perfect science, to find out the causality relationships. The onus of proving, that's how this demand has come, that the onus of proving beyond doubt that they are not related to the clinical trial ought to be on the researchers and the sponsors. It should not be on the patient to prove that he or she was injured by the clinical trial. Uncertainties in providing non-relatedness must favor the participants for compensation and not the sponsor. What we find is that only those deaths and injuries where there is a definite relationship is provided by the data safety monitoring board, they are provided compensation. But if it is a probably related or possibly related, or there are uncertainties about the relatedness, there is no compensation provided. I don't know why the benefit of doubt should be going to the industry and not to the patient, who is the weakest party in that. The causality assessment by a body not appointed by the sponsor is a must, because that is the only way there's a possibility of having a correct assessment. I think it is also important in the context of the demand of transparency and openness of the data of the clinical trial. When other researchers are able to reanalyze the clinical trial data and they find that the adverse events were not properly recorded or properly assessed, in that case, what happens to the patients who suffered and who provides them compensation? More research is needed on the issue of causality assessment. And this is my last slide. The issue of respect of autonomy is very difficult in the developing country. It is difficult to provide it primacy in the developing country setting. The context and the process need radical improvements in order to make it operational. They are very often very difficult to improve. Need for research and the recommendation on the kind of systems that is conducive for the ethical research. I think we have learned that you require a building of a whole system in order to allow the kind of commercial clinical trials that India started allowing from 2005. Without the system, if you open up the society for the commercial activities of this kind, then the consequences are not going to be good. Thank you very much.